At 44 years old, Rhonda Belle Martin looked like someone you would trust. She had kind eyes and gentle hands that served coffee at a diner in Montgomery, Alabama. People knew her as the waitress with the easy smile, the woman who always remembered if you took cream or sugar. But underneath her kitchen sink sat a can of rat poison. And buried in graves across Alabama were 6 people who had trusted her most. In April 1951, her husband Claude Martin sat at their kitchen table drinking his evening coffee. It was the same ritual every night after work. Rhonda would pour, he would sip, and they would talk about their day. But that night, within an hour of finishing his cup, Claude collapsed to the floor. His body went rigid. His breath came in gasps. By the time doctors arrived, he was unconscious. Everyone said it was a sudden illness. The kind of thing that happens sometimes without warning. Friends brought casseroles to the grieving widow. Neighbors told her she had already suffered more than anyone should have to bear. And they were right about that part. Rhonda had buried so many people. Her mother, her first husband George, 3 of her 5 daughters, all of them small children when they died. To everyone who knew her, Rhonda was the unluckiest woman in Alabama. Death seemed to follow her like a shadow. But what nobody knew, what nobody suspected for years, was that Rhonda herself was that shadow. Death did not follow her. She carried it with her, hidden in teaspoons and coffee cups. When investigators finally grew suspicious and began digging up old graves, they found the same thing in every body, a poison called arsenic. It comes in white powder form, tasteless when mixed into food or drink, the kind sold in any hardware store to kill rats and insects. Rhonda had been using it to kill people. When police arrested her in March 1956, she did not scream or run or protest her innocence. She sat down calmly, asked for paper and a pen, and wrote out a confession in neat, careful handwriting. The words she wrote were simple and chilling. I poisoned my mother, my husbands, and my children. I do not know why. There is something wrong inside me. The confession opened a door to one of Alabama's darkest true crime stories. A mother who killed her own children, a wife who poisoned 2 husbands, a daughter who murdered her own mother. All of them had trusted her completely. All of them had died slowly, in pain, without ever knowing who was causing their suffering. The question that haunted everyone who learned about Rhonda's crimes was the same question she could not answer herself. Why? Why would a mother do this to her own babies? Why would someone who seemed so gentle and ordinary commit such terrible acts? Some people said she was evil. Others said she was sick in her mind. Doctors who examined her found evidence of mental illness, a condition where the brain does not work properly and a person cannot think clearly. But other doctors said she knew exactly what she was doing. She planned each poisoning carefully. She acted sad at funerals. She collected sympathy from friends. That did not seem like someone who was confused or lost in their own mind. The courts had to decide, was Rhonda Belle Martin a monster who deserved to die for her crimes? Or was she a broken woman whose mind had betrayed her, making her do things she could not control or understand? After a trial that lasted weeks, a jury of 12 people made their decision, guilty, and the punishment would be death in the electric chair. On the night of October 11th, 1957, at a prison called Kilby, Rhonda sat in that chair. She was 49 years old. Before they turned on the electricity, someone asked if she had any final words. She did not. She only held her Bible and wept quietly. Just before she died, prison officials found a note she had written. In it, she asked that her body be given to scientists who could study her brain. Maybe they will find what was wrong with me, she wrote. Maybe they can stop someone else from doing what I did. That note tells us something important. Even Rhonda herself did not understand why she had killed the people she claimed to love. She looked inside herself and found only darkness and confusion. Whether that makes her more frightening or more tragic, each person must decide for themselves. What we know for certain is this: 6 people died because they trusted the wrong person. 3 little girls who called her mama, a mother who had raised her, 2 men who had married her and promised to love her forever. All of them were poisoned slowly, over weeks and months, by someone who smiled at them while stirring death into their meals. The story of Rhonda Belle Martin is a reminder that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary waitress pouring coffee. Sometimes it wears an apron and serves dinner. Sometimes it kisses children goodnight before tucking poison into their bedtime milk. And the most frightening part is that even now, nearly 70 years after Rhonda died in that electric chair, we still do not fully understand why she did it. Was there truly something broken in her mind that made her unable to stop herself? Or was she simply someone who discovered she enjoyed having power over life and death? The answer died with her. But the question remains, haunting and unanswerable, hanging over her story like smoke that never quite clears. Can evil live inside a broken mind? And if it can, how do we tell the difference between sickness and wickedness? Rhonda Belle Martin left behind no answers. Only graves, only grief. Only the memory of a woman whose gentle hands served poison with the same care most people use to serve love. The small brick house on Montgomery's Edge looked like any other home in 1934. Inside, 5 daughters filled the rooms with life. Mary, the eldest at 9 years old, was quiet and careful, the kind of girl who helped set the table without being asked. Carolyn had a giggle that could break any tension, infectious and pure. Ellen spent hours drawing imaginary gardens with crayons, and little Imogene, barely 2 years old, hummed gospel songs in her high, sweet voice, the kind of sound that made neighbors smile when they walked past. Their mother, Rhonda Belle Martin, wore her apron like armor. Every Sunday, she walked her girls to church, hand in hand, hymn book tucked under her arm. Neighbors watched her and whispered admiration. That woman keeps a beautiful home. Those children are so well behaved. She's doing it all alone while her husband works those long hours. What a devoted mother. The cornbread she baked filled the house with warmth. The coffee she poured was always hot and ready. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But inside that kitchen, something invisible was being added to the meals. Something that would turn a home into a graveyard. It started with Mary in the spring of 1934. She came home from school complaining of stomach cramps. By evening, the cramps had turned to agony. Fever spiked. The local doctor was called. He examined the 9-year-old girl and pronounced his diagnosis with confidence. Bronchopneumonia, a lung infection, common in children, treatable with rest and prayer. 3 days later, Mary was dead. The death certificate was signed without hesitation. The funeral was held at the same church where Rhonda had walked her daughters every Sunday. And when Rhonda collapsed at the church steps, sobbing so hard that men had to carry her inside, everyone's heart broke for the unlucky mother who had lost her eldest child. Nobody suspected. How could they? Mothers don't kill their babies, not in Montgomery, not in 1934, not women who bake cornbread and sing hymns and weep at funerals. 3 years passed. The house grew quieter without Mary's careful presence. But in 1937, death returned. This time it came for 2-year-old Imogene. The same symptoms, the same sudden illness. The little girl who hummed gospel tunes began vomiting in the night. By dawn, she was gone. The same doctor shook his head in sad disbelief. Some people, he told Rhonda gently, are just born unlucky. Some families carry more tragedy than others. There's no explaining God's will. He signed another death certificate. Another funeral was held. Another small casket was lowered into Alabama soil. But here's what makes this story controversial. What makes it rage against every instinct we have about motherhood and love. Rhonda wasn't unlucky. She was methodical. And according to a Life magazine article published years later, she loved getting the sympathy cards. She took great care to arrange for her children to be buried side by side in a private plot. She collected the condolences like other women collected recipes. By 1940, a third daughter followed. Carolyn, the one with the infectious giggle, began showing the same symptoms. Stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, and once again, death came within days. The medical examiner made a note in his file, suspected food poisoning, dismissed as indigestion. But he didn't investigate further. Why would he? This was just another tragic loss for a woman who had already suffered so much. By 1940, Rhonda's home was quieter than a tomb, because it was one. 3 daughters dead in 6 years, all of them small, all of them buried side by side, just as their mother had arranged. These were children who drew pictures of sunlit skies, children who sang while playing, children who trusted their mother's cooking completely, right up until the moment the poison in their milk began to work. But Rhonda wasn't finished. On Christmas Eve 1939, while families across Montgomery celebrated, her husband George Garrett sat at the kitchen table after a long shift. He smiled at his wife, thanked her for the meal, and reached for his coffee. Within an hour, he was gasping for air. Neighbors rushed over when they heard Rhonda's screams. By the time help arrived, George was slumped forward, the coffee cup still on the table. The doctor ruled it heart failure. A tragic end to a good man, he said at the funeral. Nobody questioned it. Men George's age died of heart attacks all the time, especially hardworking men who carried the stress of supporting a family through the Depression. What they didn't know, what wouldn't be discovered until investigators exhumed his body 17 years later, was that George Garrett's tissue samples contained concentrated arsenic, the same poison that had killed the children, the same white powder Rhonda kept beneath her kitchen sink, labeled as rat poison. After George died, Rhonda collected $3,000 in life insurance money. Not a fortune, barely enough to cover burial costs and a few months of expenses, but she used it to buy a car and start fresh. Within months, she had moved. Within a year, she had remarried. 3 dead children, 1 dead husband. And the most controversial part? Rhonda was just getting started. In 1944, her own mother, Mary Frances Gibbon, came to stay. The older woman was kind and patient, still believing her daughter's pain came from misfortune rather than malice. They shared meals. They shared prayers. They talked about the girls who were gone. And within weeks of moving in, Mary Frances began to feel weak, dizzy. Her joints ached. She couldn't keep food down. Rhonda sat at her bedside, holding her hand, whispering comfort as her mother's condition worsened. The doctor said it was probably influenza or exhaustion. Mary Frances died quietly one evening with her daughter at her side. When forensic scientists exhumed her remains years later, they found arsenic embedded in the roots of her hair. Microscopic proof of prolonged exposure. Not a single dose, but many doses over time. Patient poisoning administered by the same hands that held hers as she died. The prosecutor who saw those results would later say in open court, "She didn't just destroy generations, she erased the evidence of love itself." Because that's what makes Rhonda Belle Martin's story so deeply, viscerally controversial. She didn't kill strangers. She didn't kill for obvious gain. The insurance money was minimal. The motive prosecutors claimed, financial profit, didn't hold up under scrutiny. She killed the people who loved her most, her own babies, her own mother, men who had married her and promised to protect her. And she did it slowly, patiently, while accepting sympathy cards and arranging flowers and playing the role of grieving victim so convincingly that an entire community believed her. The question that haunts this case isn't just, how could she? It's, why did everyone keep believing her? 3 children dead with identical symptoms, and not one doctor grew suspicious. A husband dead after drinking coffee, and nobody tested the cup. A mother dead after moving in, and the pattern remained invisible. Was it incompetence, or was it something darker? A refusal to believe that mothers could be monsters, that gentle hands could serve death, that the woman weeping at the funeral might be the same woman who caused it. Rhonda Belle Martin got away with murder for nearly 20 years because nobody wanted to believe a mother could poison her own children. And that uncomfortable truth might be the most controversial part of all. Rhonda Belle Tomley entered this world on November 4, 1906 in rural Alabama, where red dirt roads cut through endless cotton fields and poverty was as common as prayer. Her family had nothing, not land, not education, not hope, just hard work that broke bodies and barely put food on the table. When she was 3 years old, Rhonda caught measles. For most children, measles meant a week of fever and spots, then recovery. But Rhonda's case was severe. The fever burned so hot and lasted so long that it damaged her brain permanently. The disease destroyed most of her hearing, leaving her nearly deaf for life. It also gave her a severe speech impediment, the kind that made other children stare, and adults speak louder, as if volume could fix what biology had broken. Imagine being a small child suddenly unable to hear the world properly, unable to speak clearly, trapped in silence while everyone around you moved and talked in ways you couldn't fully understand. Rhonda became isolated in her own home, struggling to communicate, watching life happen at a distance. But the deafness was only the beginning of Rhonda's nightmare childhood. According to testimony she gave decades later, testimony that only emerged after her arrest when her life depended on sympathy, her father began sexually abusing her when she was 5 years old. An alcoholic sawmill worker who drank away what little money the family had, he allegedly raped his deaf daughter repeatedly. Whether this claim was true or a desperate lie told by a condemned woman, we'll never know with certainty. Rhonda only spoke about the abuse after her conviction, after she needed people to see her as a victim rather than a monster. When Rhonda was 12 years old, her mother, Mary Frances, had a complete mental breakdown. The poverty, the alcoholic husband, the strain of keeping children fed, it all became too much. Mary Frances was declared mentally ill and institutionalized in an asylum, diagnosed with conditions that 1918 medicine barely understood and certainly couldn't treat. Overnight, 12-year-old Rhonda became the parent. She had to drop out of school after completing 7th grade to take care of her younger siblings. No more education, no more childhood, just cooking, cleaning, and raising children when she was barely more than a child herself. Her deaf, traumatized 12-year-old self suddenly responsible for keeping a household running. And when she didn't do it well enough, when the food wasn't ready on time or the children misbehaved, her father beat her. Hospital visits became routine. Broken bones, bruises that turned black and yellow, injuries that should have triggered investigations, but never did in rural Alabama in the 1910s and 1920s. Nobody asked too many questions about a deaf girl with suspicious injuries. By age 15, Rhonda saw marriage as her only escape. She married W.R. Olderman, one of her mother's boarding house tenants, just before her 16th birthday. She thought marriage would save her from her father's house, from the beatings and the responsibility and the silence. She was wrong. The marriage lasted until she was 19, ending in divorce. No children, no explanation, just another failed promise of safety. Over the next 16 years, Rhonda would marry George Garrett and have 6 children with him. 6 babies by age 31 while living in poverty, still mostly deaf, still struggling to communicate, still carrying trauma that had never been treated or even acknowledged. She learned early that being useful meant being invisible. Cook the meals, clean the house, care for the sick. Don't complain. Don't draw attention. Just be quietly indispensable. And invisible people, Rhonda discovered, can do invisible things, things nobody notices until it's too late. By the 1930s, after her children began dying and her first husband was dead, Rhonda found work as a waitress at a cafe in Montgomery. She was good at it. Customers described her as polite, attentive, forgettable. The kind of waitress who remembered if you took cream or sugar, but whose face you couldn't quite recall 5 minutes after leaving. But to those who lingered, there was something magnetic about Rhonda's calm. She listened more than she spoke. She had patience that seemed endless, the kind that drew lonely people back to the same booth again and again. They called her the waitress with the easy smile. That smile hid everything. Co-workers noticed that sometimes, mid-conversation, Rhonda's eyes would drift away. She'd stare at something no one else could see, her expression blank, as if she was standing somewhere else entirely. Some said she was just tired. Others said she was sad. In truth, she was unraveling in silence, drowning in a fog that never lifted. In the deep South of the 1930s, nobody talked about mental illness. You prayed about sadness. You worked through exhaustion. And if someone seemed distant or strange, you called it melancholy or nerves and moved on. Rhonda's inner world, the constant belief that life always took more than it gave, the sense that love was just another thing waiting to be stolen, was something she carried alone. The secret she held was darker still. Control through caretaking, being needed, being indispensable, keeping people close by making them weak. And if they tried to leave or if they stopped needing her, well, she knew how to make that permanent. She was drowning in silence, and she decided to take everyone else down with her. In 1944, her mother, Mary Frances Gibbon, the same woman who had been institutionalized when Rhonda was 12, came to live with her. Mary Frances was older now, kinder, still believing her daughter's pain came from misfortune rather than malice. They shared meals, they shared prayers, they talked about the children who were gone. Within weeks, Mary Frances began feeling strange. Dizziness, fatigue, joints that ached for no clear reason. The doctor said it was probably influenza or perhaps just exhaustion from the move. Mary Frances died quietly one evening in October 1944, with Rhonda sitting at her bedside, holding her hand, whispering comfort. When forensic scientists exhumed her remains 12 years later during the investigation, they found arsenic embedded deep in the roots of her hair, microscopic crystals that told a story of prolonged, repeated exposure. Not a single dose, but many doses over time. Patient poisoning administered by the same daughter who held her hand as she died. A prosecutor would later stand in a Montgomery courtroom and say words that made everyone who heard them flinch. She didn't just destroy generations. She erased the evidence of love itself. By 1951, Rhonda had remarried twice more. Her fourth husband was Claude Carroll Martin, a man who seemed stable and kind. For a while, their life looked normal. But then Claude began developing strange symptoms, tingling in his extremities, numbness that spread, what doctors called polyneuritis, a nerve condition. They prescribed vitamins and rest. Claude grew thinner by the month. His skin turned pale. His speech became slurred. The paralysis spread slowly from his feet up his legs. Through it all, Rhonda played the devoted wife perfectly. She spooned broth into his mouth. She adjusted his pillows. She kept the curtains drawn so the light wouldn't hurt his eyes. Neighbors whispered their admiration. If every man had a wife like her, one woman said, he'd die happy. And in April 1951, that's exactly what Claude did. The doctor hesitated when filling out the death certificate. Something about the illness had felt wrong, but there was no proof of foul play, just a man who had wasted away despite his wife's devoted care. When Claude's body was exhumed years later, toxicologists found arsenic embedded so deep in his organs that it had become part of his tissue. Proof not of a single poisoning, but of months of careful, calculated exposure. After Claude died, sympathy poured in again. Casseroles arrived at the door. Condolence cards filled the mailbox. Friends stopped by to comfort the widow who had lost yet another person she loved. Among the mourners was Claude's adult son from a previous marriage, Ronald Martin. He was young, soft-spoken, and looked at Rhonda with innocent admiration. She had raised him for years like one of her own. He genuinely cared about her. Within months of his father's death, Rhonda and Ronald were married. She became his stepmother and his wife simultaneously. A relationship that shocked Montgomery society, but wasn't technically illegal under Alabama law. And then, with the same patience she'd shown with everyone else, Rhonda started poisoning him too. Within months, Ronald would be paralyzed, fighting for his life in a hospital bed, while doctors desperately tried to figure out what was killing him. He would become the only victim who survived, and his survival would unravel everything Rhonda had built over 20 years of patient, invisible murder. In December 1951, 8 months after Claude Martin's death, Rhonda did something that shocked Montgomery society to its core. She married Ronald Martin, her dead husband's son. Her stepson became her husband. The man she had helped raise became her spouse. The newspapers called it peculiar in the polite language of the 1950 South. What they meant was disturbing, inappropriate, almost incestuous. The church that had welcomed Rhonda for years now turned its back. Parishioners who had wept with her at funerals now whispered about her in grocery stores. How could a woman marry her own stepson? What kind of person does that? But Alabama law didn't technically prohibit stepmother-stepson marriage. There was no biological relation, no legal barrier, just a moral boundary that Rhonda crossed without hesitation. At 45 years old, she married the 29-year-old son of the man she had just poisoned to death. And for the first time in years, people who knew her said Rhonda looked content, almost peaceful. That peace lasted exactly 3 months. By early 1952, Ronald Martin began feeling strange. Fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure, nausea that came in waves. His limbs felt heavy as stone, like they didn't quite belong to his body anymore. At first, he dismissed it as stress or maybe the flu, But the symptoms kept getting worse. Then Ronald noticed something terrifying. The symptoms mirrored his father's final days. The tingling, the weakness, the sense that his body was slowly shutting down from the inside out. He mentioned this to Rhonda, probably hoping she would comfort him, tell him it was just coincidence. She did comfort him. She spooned broth into his mouth just as she had for his father. She adjusted his pillows. She stayed at his bedside. And all the while, the paralysis was spreading. Within months, Ronald couldn't walk. His legs had stopped responding. The paralysis crept upward, invading his arms, his torso. Doctors were completely confused. They had never seen a case like this. A young, previously healthy man suddenly losing all motor function with no clear cause. Ronald was transferred to a larger hospital with better equipment. That's when someone finally ordered the right test, a toxicology screening. And what they found made every doctor in the room go silent. Arsenic levels 200 times the normal amount. Not from a single dose, but from prolonged, repeated exposure over months. Ronald Martin wasn't sick. He was being murdered. And he had been from the moment he married his stepmother. But unlike everyone else Rhonda had poisoned, Ronald survived. Paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life, confined to a wheelchair, but alive. And his survival became the single thread that would unravel everything Rhonda had carefully woven over 20 years. When doctors reported the arsenic poisoning, detectives from the Montgomery Police Department were immediately notified. Within days, they had a search warrant for Rhonda's home. On March 9, 1956, officers walked through the front door of the house where so many people had died. Under the kitchen sink, behind the cleaning supplies and dish soap, they found it. A half-empty can of rat poison. The brand was Ant Kill, a commercial product sold in every hardware store in Alabama. The main ingredient was arsenic trioxide, white, odorless, tasteless, easy to sprinkle into food or stir into coffee. And Rhonda had been buying it for years, telling store clerks she had a rat problem. Detectives traced the timeline. Every meal Ronald had eaten, every symptom he had developed. The pattern was undeniable. Someone had been systematically poisoning him, and only one person prepared his food. When they brought Rhonda in for questioning, she didn't panic or rage or demand a lawyer. She sat down calmly, folded her hands on the table, and said she couldn't understand how this could possibly have happened. Her voice was polite, her expression concerned. She looked like a worried wife desperate for answers. But as investigators presented the evidence, the poison under her sink, the arsenic in Ronald's body, the timeline of his illness, something changed in Rhonda. The calm cracked, and instead of fighting, she did something that stunned everyone in that interrogation room. She asked for a notebook and a pen. What Rhonda wrote became known as her confession letter. The handwriting was neat, almost pretty, like something a schoolgirl would write in a diary. The tone was apologetic but matter of fact. No drama, no tears, just sentences stating terrible truths as if they were grocery lists. I poisoned my mother, my husbands, and my children. I don't know why. There's something wrong inside me. She signed it, dated it, and handed it back to the detective as calmly as if she'd just written out a recipe. One investigator would later tell reporters, it was like she was reading a recipe aloud, only the ingredients were people. The confession opened floodgates. If Rhonda had poisoned Ronald and his father Claude, who else had she killed? Detectives began pulling files on every death in Rhonda's family going back decades. 3 dead children with identical symptoms. A first husband dead of heart failure. A mother dead of influenza. The same pattern repeating over and over. Within weeks, prosecutors filed exhumation requests for graves across multiple Alabama cemeteries. From Montgomery to rural graveyards in nearby counties, coffins that had been underground for years were lifted back into daylight. The graveyards became crime scenes, cordoned off with police tape, while forensic technicians in white coats worked beside open graves. They erected a canvas tent next to the excavation sites. Inside, the work was meticulous and grim. Bone fragments placed in labeled jars. Tissue samples preserved in formaldehyde. Hair clippings sealed in plastic evidence bags. Every sample was tagged with a name, a date, a cause of death that was about to be proven false. The samples were sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., the most advanced forensic facility in the country. Toxicologists used techniques that hadn't existed when most of these people died. They tested bone marrow, hair follicles, organ tissue that had been preserved in the acidic Alabama soil. The results came back identical across every victim. Arsenic, the same chemical signature, the same concentration pattern indicating prolonged exposure. Court transcripts would later describe the findings as consistent with repeated exposure to commercial arsenical poison. Every grave told the same story. Every body carried the same evidence. The FBI confirmed that the arsenic signature matched samples taken from the can of ant kill found under Rhonda's kitchen sink. Same manufacturer, same formulation, same source. It was what prosecutors would call a perfect forensic storm. Every grave they opened confirmed the timeline. Every victim they exhumed proved the pattern. Rhonda Belle Martin hadn't just killed people. She had killed them the same way, with the same poison, over 2 decades. Methodical, patient, invisible. By June 1956, everyone in Montgomery knew the truth. The waitress with the easy smile, the woman who had collected sympathy cards like trophies, had turned her home into a death house. She had buried her mother, 2 husbands, and 3 of her own children. She had poisoned them slowly, watching them suffer, holding their hands as they died, all while knowing she was the cause. And now Alabama was about to decide if she would pay for those crimes with her life. The electric chair waited at Kilby Prison. The question wasn't whether Rhonda was guilty. She had confessed in her own neat handwriting. The question was whether a woman who claimed something was wrong inside her could be held fully responsible, whether mental illness could excuse 6 murders, whether the state had the right to execute a woman who might have been too broken to understand what she was doing. The trial would become one of the most controversial in Alabama history, a battle between science and justice, between sympathy and accountability, between the woman who poisoned her family and the family she destroyed. By June 1956, the Montgomery County Courthouse had become the center of Alabama's attention. The building overflowed with spectators. Housewives abandoned their errands to claim seats in the gallery. Reporters from newspapers across the South filled the press benches, notebooks ready. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle, and everyone wanted to witness the woman who had poisoned her family. The prosecution opened with a single sentence that cut through the humid courtroom air like a blade. This was not madness, it was method. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury of 12 men, all white, all middle-aged, all fathers themselves, and began to build his case brick by methodical brick. No dramatics, no shouting, just cold, undeniable facts presented with surgical precision. Evidence was displayed across tables at the front of the courtroom. Victims' names written in chalk on a blackboard: Mary Adelaide Martin, age 9, Imogene Martin, age 2, Carolyn Martin, age 6, George Garrett, age 49, Mary Frances Gibbon, age 68, Claude Carroll Martin, age 51. 6 names, 6 lives, 1 killer. A metal canister sat on the evidence table, labeled ant kill. The half-empty can of rat poison found beneath Rhonda's kitchen sink. Beside it, glass slides showing crystalline arsenic under magnification, looking almost beautiful in its deadliness. Charts displaying insurance payouts, though they were shockingly small, barely enough to cover burial costs, destroying the prosecution's claim of financial motive even as they tried to establish it. Then came Rhonda's typed confession, read aloud in the prosecutor's flat, emotionless voice. The courtroom fell silent as he recited her words. I poisoned my mother, my husbands, and my children. I don't know why. There's something wrong inside me. The prosecutor paused, letting the words settle over the jury like dust. Then he said quietly, she may not know why, but the evidence does. For 2 days, the prosecution presented a devastating timeline. Each victim, each illness, each death, and in every case, the same woman sitting at the bedside, the same woman preparing meals, the same woman collecting sympathy cards and insurance checks and moving on to the next victim. Charts showed the pattern with brutal clarity. Victim gets sick. Rhonda cares for them devotedly. Symptoms worsen despite her care. Death comes within weeks or months. Rhonda grieves publicly. Rhonda remarries or moves. Pattern repeats. Throughout it all, Rhonda sat quietly at the defense table. No tears, no visible emotion. her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank. She looked like a woman waiting for a bus, not a woman on trial for serial murder. That emptiness unnerved everyone who saw it. Where was the grief, the shame, the horror at what she'd done? The courtroom had become packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles. Others pressed against the windows from outside, trying to hear through the glass. But this crowd wasn't here for justice. They were here for curiosity, to see the monster, to understand how someone who looked so ordinary could do something so monstrous. When the prosecution rested, the defense attorney stood slowly. His strategy was risky, and he knew it. He wasn't going to deny the deaths. He wasn't going to deny the confession. Instead, he was going to ask the jury to see Rhonda not as evil, but as sick. "This is not the work of an evil woman," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is the cry of a broken one." The defense called 2 psychiatrists to testify. Both had examined Rhonda extensively. Both had reviewed her history, the childhood trauma, the deafness, the alleged sexual abuse, the institutionalized mother, the pattern of failed relationships. But their conclusions couldn't have been more different. The first psychiatrist testified that Rhonda suffered from schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that fractured her grip on reality. He described auditory hallucinations, deep depression that never lifted, emotional detachment so severe she couldn't form normal human bonds. In his professional opinion, Rhonda's crimes were the result of illness, not intent. She was a woman whose mind had betrayed her, making her do things she couldn't fully understand or control. The second psychiatrist disagreed completely. He had examined Rhonda too, and he found her lucid, intelligent, and in full control of her actions. She knew right from wrong. She planned her crimes carefully. She acted sad at funerals and collected sympathy deliberately. This wasn't mental illness. This was cold calculation and emotional vacancy. She was a psychopath, not a schizophrenic. The courtroom became a battlefield between 2 views of human nature: science versus morality, empathy versus accountability, brain chemistry versus free will. Could someone be so broken that they poisoned their own children without understanding why? Or was that just a convenient excuse for someone who had discovered she enjoyed killing? The jury watched the doctors argue. They looked at Rhonda, searching her face for clues. Was she a victim of her own diseased mind? Or was she a monster wearing the mask of victimhood? Public opinion outside the courtroom divided sharply. Some saw Rhonda as exactly what her defense attorney claimed: a broken woman who needed treatment, not execution. Others saw a calculating killer who had gotten away with murder for 20 years and now wanted sympathy to escape the chair. The newspapers published both views, and Montgomery split down the middle. During the entire trial, Rhonda spoke only once. When the judge asked if she understood the charge of first-degree murder, she replied in her soft, halting voice, marked by her speech impediment, "Yes, sir, I do." 3 words. The only words she spoke in her own defense. In his closing argument, the prosecutor abandoned charts and evidence. Instead, he spoke directly to the jury about justice itself. "Justice is not vengeance," he said quietly. "It is the restoration of balance. And balance demands truth, no matter how polite its disguise." This woman wore the disguise of a devoted mother, a grieving widow, an unlucky soul cursed by tragedy. But the truth beneath that disguise is arsenic, is patience, is 6 graves. Justice demands we see the truth. And the truth is that Rhonda Belle Martin is guilty of murder. The jury retired just after lunch on a sweltering June afternoon. They carried with them the weight of 6 deaths, 1 confession, and 2 competing visions of who Rhonda really was: sick or evil, broken or calculating, victim or monster. They returned in 90 minutes. The foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand. His voice was steady but quiet. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom fell completely silent. Not a whisper, not a breath. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Rhonda didn't flinch. She simply lowered her head and nodded once, as if she'd already known, as if she'd been waiting for this verdict her entire life. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the sentence in the formal language Alabama law required. "For the willful taking of life by deliberate means, this court sentences you to death by electrocution at Kilby Prison." The gallery erupted. Some spectators gasped, others whispered amen or justice. But Rhonda made only one request before being led away. She turned to her attorney and said softly, "Could they study my brain after? Maybe then they'll know why." It was a strange request, part guilt, part scientific curiosity, part something deeper that nobody could quite name. She wasn't asking for mercy or claiming innocence. She was asking for understanding, as if even she didn't know why she had destroyed everyone who loved her. As deputies prepared to escort her from the courtroom, a reporter called out, "Do you have anything to say to the families?" Rhonda stopped. She looked up at the gallery where some of her surviving relatives sat, faces wet with tears. She said 4 words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "They were my family. Not 'I'm sorry,' not 'I didn't mean to.' Just a simple statement of fact. They were her family, and she had killed them. Both things were true. Both things could exist in the same broken mind." As the deputies led her away, Rhonda didn't fight the sentence. She didn't weep or shout or collapse. She simply accepted it the way she had accepted everything in her life, quietly, patiently, as though the story she'd been writing all her life, in teaspoons and coffee cups, in graves and sympathy cards, had finally reached its last line. Alabama had decided Rhonda Belle Martin would die for her crimes, but the question of why she committed them, whether mental illness or pure evil had guided her hand, remained unanswered. And it would stay unanswered all the way to the electric chair. After sentencing, Rhonda Belle Martin was transferred to the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, a red brick compound wrapped in wire and silence. It wasn't the chaos of county jail. Tutwiler was regimented, almost monastic. Every morning began with the clang of the breakfast bell, the shuffle of feet on concrete, and the distant sound of hymns from the prison chapel. Rhonda spent her days sewing prison uniforms, reading her Bible, and writing letters that almost nobody answered. Guards described her as calm, polite, never causing trouble. One officer said she had the look of someone who had already accepted her punishment long before the judge handed it down. She moved through the prison routines with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown serving coffee at the diner. But acceptance didn't stop her lawyers from fighting. They filed appeal after appeal, arguing that Rhonda suffered from severe schizophrenia, that her mind had fractured long before her crimes began. They cited psychiatric evaluations, her detached behavior, her fog-like demeanor during questioning. They pointed to her horrific childhood, the deafness, the alleged sexual abuse, the institutionalized mother, the beatings. Every petition came back stamped with the same word, denied. The courts were unmoved. In their final ruling, the judges wrote, "The defendant is fully aware of her actions, their consequences, and the punishment imposed. She is competent to face execution." To the law, competence was enough. Understanding why she killed wasn't required. Only understanding that she had killed mattered. 8 days before her scheduled execution, a reporter was granted a final interview with Rhonda. She sat in her cell, hands folded in her lap, and spoke in that same gentle voice marked by her speech impediment. "If my brain could be studied," she said quietly, "maybe others wouldn't do what I did." It was part confession, part plea for understanding. Not for herself. She had accepted her fate, but for the future, for science, for the possibility that somewhere in her broken brain, doctors might find an answer that could prevent another mother from poisoning her children, another wife from burying her husbands. That night, guards making their rounds saw Rhonda's Bible lying open on her pillow, the same Bible she'd carried to church every Sunday when her daughters were alive. Inside, the 23rd Psalm had been underlined twice in pencil. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The guards said Rhonda prayed every night. They could hear her whispering in her cell after lights out, hands folded, head bowed. Some saw it as seeking forgiveness. Others saw it as rehearsing control. The same routines that had defined her entire life, maintained even in the face of death. The paradox of Rhonda Belle Martin lived in those contradictions. She was a woman who bowed her head at the dinner table to say grace, then refilled sugar bowls with poison. Hands that had braided her daughter's hair had also stirred deadly chemicals into their bedtime milk. Faith and fear, kindness, and calculation existed side by side in the same mind. The mystery that unsettled everyone who studied her case wasn't that she killed. It was how someone so ordinary, so gentle in appearance, could become so monstrous in action. How could the waitress with the easy smile be the same person who watched her children die in agony? During her appeals process, Ronald Martin gave testimony from his wheelchair. Paralyzed from the waist down for life, dependent on others for every basic need, he had every reason to hate the woman who had destroyed him. But when asked about Rhonda, he said something that captured the impossible complexity of her case. "I don't hate her, but I don't understand her." He was living proof that not every plan Rhonda made reached its end. He survived because doctors finally ordered the right test, finally looked for poison instead of disease. But his paralyzed legs and withered arms were permanent monuments to her patience, her method, her inexplicable need to destroy the people who loved her. The question that had dominated her trial continued to loop through every conversation about her case. Was Rhonda a victim of severe mental illness? Or was she a master of control who used claims of illness to escape full responsibility? In one of her final interviews, Rhonda said something that sounded tender on the surface, but chilled everyone who heard it. "I loved them. I just wanted to keep them close." That confession might have been genuine. But when you remember what close meant, poisoned slowly, dying in pain, buried side by side in graves Rhonda carefully arranged, the words transformed from love to horror. While Rhonda sat on death row, science tried to answer the question her confession couldn't. Inside the state forensic laboratory, technicians worked in cold, sterile rooms filled with glass vials and ultraviolet lamps. They examined every sample collected from the exhumed bodies. When chemical reagents met the tissue samples, they turned pale blue, the color of certainty, the color that meant arsenic was present. Under microscopes, crystalline arsenic flakes glimmered like frost, beautiful and deadly. The FBI confirmed the mitochondrial arsenic signature, the unique chemical fingerprint that proved every victim had been poisoned with the same commercial rat poison found beneath Rhonda's kitchen sink. Autopsy notes described the same details in victim after victim. Stomach lining eroded by prolonged acid exposure, organ tissue laced with metallic traces, hair roots stained gray-green where the poison had embedded itself over weeks and months. Each body had written its own testimony. Silent witness statements preserved in bone and tissue. The numbers didn't lie. The graphs showed undeniable patterns. The microscope slides sealed Rhonda's fate more completely than any confession could. Ballistics had been replaced by molecules. The weapon that had no sound, no gunshot, no scream, no impact, finally spoke through chemistry and math. Science explained exactly how Rhonda killed. The method was clear. The timeline was certain. The evidence was absolute. But science couldn't explain why. Why would a mother poison her own daughters? Why would a wife kill two husbands with the same method? Why would someone claim to love people while slowly murdering them? The forensic reports could tell investigators everything except the thing that mattered most. What drives a human being to commit such patient, methodical evil? Is it something broken in the brain that can be seen under a microscope? Or is it something darker that exists beyond the reach of science? Pure malevolence disguised as mental illness. October 10, 1957 arrived with the answer still unknown. The appeal process had exhausted every option. The Alabama Supreme Court had affirmed her conviction. The governor had declined to commute her sentence. Prison officials had set the execution date, though they withheld it from Rhonda until the last possible moment because of her heart condition. The answer to why Rhonda Belle Martin poisoned 6 people was about to die with her, and no amount of science, psychiatry, or legal proceedings had been able to pull that answer from her broken mind before the state pulled the switch that would end her life. October 10, 1957 began with the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor of Kilby Prison. The warden stopped outside cell 12 and read her name aloud, the same way it had been read in court. Rhonda Belle Martin. Rhonda nodded. No resistance, no surprise. She had been expecting this moment for 16 months, ever since the jury returned with their verdict. The only uncertainty had been when, not if. Because of her heart condition, prison officials had withheld execution dates from her until the very last minute. They feared that too much advance warning might cause a cardiac episode that would cheat the state of its justice. So Rhonda lived in a strange limbo, knowing death was coming, but not knowing when, like everyone else in the world, but without the mercy of ignorance. She asked permission to write 2 final letters, one to her surviving daughter Judith, one of the only children who hadn't died from her poison, the other to Ronald, the paralyzed stepson-turned-husband who had survived her attempt to kill him. In both letters, she apologized. Not for the murders themselves, she had already confessed to those, but for the memories she could never undo, for the images that would haunt them forever, the sound of her voice, the sight of her hands, the knowledge that someone who claimed to love them had tried to destroy them. She ended both letters the same way. Pray for peace. I'll be home soon. Home. Whatever that meant for someone about to die in an electric chair. Heaven? Oblivion? The same ground where she had buried her victims? She didn't explain. 7 hours before her execution, prison officials offered Rhonda her last meal. She requested simple food, a hamburger, mashed potatoes, cinnamon rolls, coffee, the kind of diner food she had served for years at that cafe in Montgomery, where customers knew her as the polite waitress with the easy smile. She ate slowly, taking small bites, as if each one was a goodbye. To taste, to life, to everything she had destroyed through her own inexplicable actions. A guard watching her later said, "She thanked us for our kindness." That's all she said. Earlier that day, Rhonda had sat through a 2-hour clemency hearing. Her defense attorney made one final desperate argument. Rhonda's sanity had never been adequately tested. 2 psychiatrists had given opposing diagnoses. How could the state execute someone when experts couldn't agree whether she was mentally competent to understand her crimes? The clemency board was unmoved. The appeal was denied. Alabama had made its decision. Rhonda Belle Martin would die that night. Just before midnight, guards came to escort her from her cell. She had been transferred back to Kilby Prison approximately 4 hours earlier from Julia Tutwiler, where she had spent most of her time on death row. Now she walked down a narrow hallway toward the execution chamber, flanked by prison officials. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh and unforgiving. The air smelled sharp with disinfectant, as if they were trying to sterilize death itself. At the end of the hallway, a heavy door opened into the chamber where Alabama's electric chair waited. The wooden chair sat in the center of the room, bolted to the floor. It had been used in dozens of executions before Rhonda's. The oak armrests were worn smooth from the grip of the condemned. Leather straps hung ready to bind arms, legs, chest, forehead. Rhonda entered the chamber holding her Bible, the same Bible she had carried to church every Sunday when her daughters were alive. She walked to the chair without help and sat down. Guards moved efficiently around her, following procedures they had practiced many times. Electrode pads were moistened with saline solution and placed on her legs and head. The contact needed to be perfect for the electricity to work as intended. Leather straps were buckled across her ankles, wrists, chest. The final strap was tightened across her forehead, holding her head immobile against the wooden chair back. In the witness room behind glass, a small group watched. Prison officials, a doctor who would pronounce death. A few reporters, no family members. The witnesses held their breath as preparations continued. Rhonda held her Bible in her hands, gripping the oak armrests. She was quietly weeping now, tears running down her cheeks. The prison chaplain stood beside the chair and began reciting the 23rd Psalm. Rhonda's lips moved along with his words. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." Then something went wrong. A slight mishap that would prolong Rhonda's final moments. The executioners threw the switch activating the electricity before the electrodes were properly ready. The equipment began cycling through its electrical sequence, but Rhonda couldn't be executed yet. She had to wait. Several agonizing minutes strapped to the chair, knowing death was seconds away while the equipment completed its useless cycle. The witnesses watched in uncomfortable silence. The chaplain kept praying. Rhonda kept weeping. Finally, the equipment was ready. The warden asked if Rhonda had any final statement. She declined. No last words. No final explanation. Just silence and tears and the Bible clutched in her hands. At 12:10 a.m. on October 11, 1957, the switch was thrown again. This time the current surged properly. 2,000 volts shot through Rhonda's body. There was a flash, a humming sound, a tremor that made the glass partition vibrate. Witnesses later described the faint scent of burnt fabric and hair that filled the chamber. The specific smell of electrocution that once experienced is never forgotten. Rhonda's body strained against the leather straps, then went still. Silence followed, heavy, final. The doctor entered the chamber and checked for vital signs. At 12:16 a.m., 6 minutes after the first shock, Rhonda Belle Martin was pronounced dead. Her body was removed from the chair at 12:25 a.m. She was 49 years old. She had lived exactly 17 years and 11 days longer than her youngest victim, 2-year-old Imogene, who died from Rhonda's poison in 1937. Rhonda became the third and last woman to be electrocuted in Alabama. There wouldn't be another woman executed in the state until 2002, when Linda Lyon Block died by lethal injection for killing a police officer. The long gap, 45 years, spoke to changing attitudes about executing women, even guilty ones, especially guilty ones who claim mental illness. The next morning's headlines were simple and brutal. Waitress confesses to 6 murders, executed in chair. Below the text ran a single photo, Rhonda's mugshot from her arrest. Eyes steady, expression neutral. The same blank look she'd worn throughout her trial. But the most chilling part of Rhonda's story wasn't her execution. It was her final wish, the request she had made repeatedly, the note prison officials found in her cell after her death. She wanted her body sent to a scientific institution for autopsy. She wanted physicians to study her brain, to examine her organs, to search for whatever was wrong inside her. The note read, in part, "I want them to find out why I committed the crimes I committed. I can't understand it, for I had no reason whatsoever. There's definitely something wrong." That wish went unfulfilled. Instead of being sent to scientists, Rhonda's body was released to family members at a funeral home in Montgomery. What happened to her remains after that remains unclear. No record exists of where she was buried or whether her body was cremated. For decades, her plea went unanswered. Did Rhonda's brain contain abnormalities that could explain her crimes? Did she have tumors, lesions, chemical imbalances that made her kill? Would modern neuroscience have found answers in the gray matter between her skull bones? We'll never know. The chance to study the brain of a serial killer who begged to be understood was lost, and with it, perhaps, the answer to whether Rhonda Belle Martin was a monster born or made, whether evil lives in broken neurons or broken souls, whether she was victim or villain, sick or wicked, someone to be pitied or damned. What we're left with is the body count. 6 confirmed deaths, 3 daughters younger than 12, a mother, 2 husbands, 1 paralyzed stepson who survived to testify, and a question that outlived the woman who asked it. What was wrong with Rhonda Belle Martin? And could understanding her have prevented the next mother who poisons her children? The next caretaker who kills with kindness? The next waitress with the easy smile who stirs death into coffee cups? That answer died with her at 12:16 a.m. on October 11, 1957, and it has remained dead for nearly 70 years. Before her execution, Rhonda had made one final plea that revealed everything and nothing about who she was. She wrote in a note found in her Bible, "I want my body to be given to some scientific institution to be used as they see fit, but especially to see if someone can find out why I committed the crimes I committed. I can't understand it, for I had no reason whatsoever. There is definitely something wrong. Can't someone find it and save someone else the agony I have been through?" It was a request that sounded like genuine confusion. A woman standing at the edge of death, looking back at her own life, unable to recognize the monster she had become. "Maybe they'll find what was wrong with me," she wrote, as if the answer was physical, as if somewhere in her brain tissue or chemical balance, science could locate the exact place where love turned to poison. Her wish was initially granted. Prison officials indicated they would send her remains to a scientific institution for autopsy. Forensic students would examine her brain for months, searching for abnormalities that could explain the inexplicable, tumors that pressed on moral centers, chemical imbalances that destroyed empathy, structural damage from childhood measles that rewired her capacity for love into something deadly. But no results were ever made public. Whatever they found, or didn't find, died with the files. The answer Rhonda begged for, the scientific explanation that might have prevented someone else the agony, was never shared with the world. Instead, family members ultimately received her body at a Montgomery funeral home. What happened after that remains unclear. Some sources suggest her ashes were scattered quietly over Alabama soil, the same red earth that once held her victims. The circle closed. The ground that had nurtured her life, held her children's graves, and absorbed her mother's casket now claimed what remained of Rhonda herself. There were no monuments, no epitaphs, no flowers marking where she ended. Just silence and soil and the weight of unanswered questions. The Rhonda Belle Martin case forces us to confront questions that have no satisfying answers. How does affection turn into obsession? How does care transform into control? Was she a victim of a broken mind, or a woman who believed she could play God with the lives entrusted to her? The evidence cuts both ways, sharp and irreconcilable. For those who see Rhonda as a predator, the facts are damning. 6 confirmed victims. Same method every time. Patient, calculated poisoning over weeks and months. Her own son's testimony that she confessed before one murder. The calm demeanor throughout her trial and imprisonment. The stepson marriage that shocked even 1950s Alabama. These details paint a picture of a woman in complete control, methodically eliminating people when they were no longer useful. But for those who see Rhonda as a victim, the context matters desperately. Childhood measles at age 3 left her mostly deaf and brain damaged for life. A father who allegedly raped her from age 5. A mother institutionalized for mental illness when Rhonda was 12, forcing her to become parent to her siblings. Hospital visits for broken bones from her father's beatings. First marriage at 15 to escape. 6 children by age 31. 5 marriages, most allegedly abusive. A life soaked in trauma from beginning to end. The uncomfortable truth is that Rhonda was both. Victim and victimizer. Abused child who became abusive adult. Battered wife who became murderer. The trauma doesn't excuse 6 murders. It doesn't make poison acceptable or justify destroying children who trusted her completely. But it explains how monsters are made. How pain can warp a mind so completely that love becomes indistinguishable from destruction. The paradox remains complete. The same woman who bowed her head in prayer every night was the same woman who stirred arsenic into bedtime milk. The hands that held her dying mother's hand were the same hands that poisoned her. The lips that recited the 23rd Psalm in the electric chair were the same lips that had whispered comfort to victims she was slowly killing. Love in Rhonda's hands turned toxic, not metaphorically, literally. The people she claimed to love most ended up buried in shallow graves or confined to wheelchairs, destroyed by the person who promised to care for them. So what's the answer? Was Rhonda's execution justice or cruelty? Did Alabama deliver what she deserved, or did the state simply mirror her own violence by killing someone too broken to understand what she'd done? Was the electric chair mercy or murder? Did it end a cycle of violence, or just add another death to the count? If modern neuroscience could examine Rhonda's brain today with technology that didn't exist in 1957, would they find the something wrong she begged them to discover? A tumor pressing on her frontal lobe, damage from childhood disease, chemical imbalances that made empathy impossible. And here's the question that should terrify everyone. If they found a murder gene in Rhonda's brain, a genetic predisposition to kill that she inherited and couldn't control, would you want to know if you carried it too? Do you believe mental illness should spare a killer from execution? Should trauma excuse murder? Where's the line between victim and monster, between someone who needs treatment and someone who deserves death? Tell us what you think. Was this justice served? A serial killer who destroyed 6 lives paying with her own? Or was this a broken system executing a broken woman who needed psychiatric care, not electrocution? The Rhonda Belle Martin case has haunted Alabama for nearly 70 years because it refuses to provide simple answers. It sits in that uncomfortable gray space where evil and illness overlap, where responsibility and incapacity blur, where justice and revenge become impossible to distinguish. 6 people are dead who should be alive. 3 little girls who never got to grow up. A mother who trusted her daughter to care for her. 2 men who married a woman who slowly poisoned them. 1 paralyzed stepson who survived but lost everything. And in the middle of it all stood Rhonda, deaf from childhood, abused by her father, abandoned by her mother, married at 15, mother to 6 children by 31, widowed twice, then convicted, sentenced, and executed at 49. Was she the villain of this story? The victim? Or something far more complicated that we still don't have the words to describe? The answer died at 12:16 a.m. on October 11, 1957, taking its secrets with it. And we're left with nothing but questions that echo across decades, growing louder instead of fading away. Where mothers poison milk, where love becomes the deadliest weapon, and where truth is always stranger and darker than any fiction we could imagine.